Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here at my wormery, and I've got a couple bins I need feeding today. They're the ones that you see down here. The one labeled the 22nd of April, and the other one's dated 22nd of March. So these go in a clockwise fashion from oldest to newest. So there's about a month of age in between these two bins, March, April. Both started on the 22nd of that month. And like I've been doing lately, I've been trying to put little checklists together for myself just to help me stay on track with what I'm trying to accomplish in each of my worm bin maintenance visits. And in this case, it's pretty straightforward. It's just a couple feedings of bins. But sometimes people are interested in knowing the statistics and information about the bins. So in this case, the two bins that we're working on, referred to as the 22s, since they both started on the 22nd of their respective months. They're now at the age of 113 and what do we got here? 82 days. And these numbers here, 14 and 12, just indicate the total number of feedings that each of these bins have received over that elapsed amount of time. Now, one thing I definitely noticed on one of these bins recently was that the March 22 one, the older one, was beginning to drip down into the bin that's right beneath it. And we've recently transitioned into the summer months, and it's getting much more warm, much more humid. So while I was really attempting very hard to maintain moisture in my bins over the winter, I've kind of flip-flopped now. I'm now in the mode of trying to allow the bins to shed a lot of their moisture because they're just not evaporating, they're not drying out because of the high concentration of moisture in the air. In order to try to get the material in these bins to begin drying out a little bit, one thing that I've done was I started to eliminate the plastic coverings that I've been putting on each bin, allowing them to evaporate a little bit more. Another thing I've been doing is trying to use plentiful amounts of dry bedding when I feed. And in this case, it's just a cardboard box that I shredded up into little chunks that we're going to use as the bedding underneath today's feeding. And I guess the only other thing going on with these two bins is that they do seem like they're approaching their finish pretty soon because the material in the bins is very far along. And the bins are almost at capacity because they're not very large bins. There are a couple of my more shallow bins. So I'm debating on where to go next with these. I've toyed with the idea of, starting the process of trying to evacuate the worms, trying to migrate the worms out of the finished castings material so that they could be scooped out and then we could harvest the material. So we're going to just check in on these as if it's an everyday feeding, but if we have an inkling that maybe we do want to start proceeding with the migration of the worms to facilitate the harvesting of the compost, then we might not feed the way we normally do, which is down the middle. We might start feeding the bins off on the far edge, one or the other edge, so that they have an opportunity to evacuate the finished compost and move over into a new setup of fresh bedding and fresh food and everything. And that'll simplify the process of harvesting their castings. So why don't we get one of the bins up here onto the bench and we'll get to work. So now down here on the bench you can see even last time the older of the two bins, the March 22 bin, was out here on the bench, it did spill a bunch of fluid out onto the table. Of the two bins we're working on today, it's the older one, the March 22 bin, that actually has perforations, holes punched into the bottom of the container, allowing for excess moisture to drain out. And that's usually not a situation in my bins. In fact, historically, I've always had very dry material in my bins. It's only more recently, since I started using plastic to cover my bins, at least in the more dry months, that I finally got the moisture level in my bins where I want it. In fact, now, it's really too high. So that's the reason I've moved away from using the plastic to cover the material. So it's always, it's always a game of, evaluating your current situation and adapting to it, because there's no one-size-fits-all usually in vermicomposting. There's usually some adaptation that you have to do to your local situation, or to what the worms are doing, or what the food's doing, or whatever the case may be. So it's always important to remain flexible when you're vermicomposting and just basically go with the flow. So let's go get that first bin out here. So this is the one with the holes in the bottom. And yeah, the bin has really seen better days. You can see the the handle is totally trashed. Every time I accidentally grab there, I just keep further breaking the container. So I don't know if it's the best container anymore to use for this activity, because the compost does really begin getting fairly heavy as it starts adding up, because it is a fairly dense material. So I guess the first thing we see when we open up the box is that the material across the top does seem to be mainly, you know, fresh castings. It's nice and level, because the way we left this 8 days ago when it was last fed, it was sort of turned up and kind of chunky and kind of all over the place, because we were trying to scoop all the material from down low where we knew that there was still some uncomposted materials, to get that uncomposted material up and out of the bottom of the bin so that it has a greater opportunity to be broken down by the worms. And then we fed down the middle. So down the middle is where we would probably expect to see the greatest amount of worm activity. Before we get down into the middle of the bin though, I'm thinking we just do a quick inspection of the material in the surrounding areas, just to see if in fact we're really getting closer and closer to the finish line, as I suspect we are. Sometimes I like to sort of scoop up all of this larger material that surfaces for some reason, and then always try to focus it back down into the feeding zone after we feed. So just some of these chunks of leaf and stuff that I've scraped off to the side, we'll make sure that we put that back down into the feeding zone when we're done here. So let's just start over on this side and see what we've got going on. The material, I can tell just from touching it, it's pretty damp and it's pretty densely populated with worms. But as you look through it, you know, here and there you might find a little stick, or you might run into a leaf stem. Whenever I use leaves as bedding, the stems always take a little longer to break down because they're a harder material than the soft leaf. So that's par for the course when you're using that type of material in your bin. But it really doesn't take that much longer to break down. It definitely gets much softer. It's not the same as it was when it was first placed in there. You can definitely feel the progress it's making as it's breaking down. Over the past few feedings, our main reason for wanting to dig down like this was to look for any pockets of material like this where it's just some bedding that had been used in the past, a little jumble of leaves in their stems that may be resting up against the bottom of the bin, which is where we don't expect the worms to be able to very easily access the material. So the whole aim of that is to try to get that material up a little bit higher, closer to the surface, or at least suspended throughout the material so that it's easier for the worms to approach it from all angles to continue the breakdown process. But I was pretty convinced over the past few feedings that we've done a nice job on getting all that sort of low material up off the bottom. But I've kind of just gotten into the habit with some of these more mature bins just to give myself peace of mind that I'm not stuck with a whole bunch of uncomposted bedding at the bottom of my bins. I just want to make sure that the stuff has been jostled up off the bottom to give it all a fair chance at being broken down. And I think we're getting there. So finding sticks and stems here and there is normal, but I don't think we're seeing enough to really warrant a great deal of concern. So I think the agitation of the material that we've been doing lately has helped a lot. So most of that stuff that was down at the bottom is now in a place where it can more readily be broken down, accessed by the worms, and eaten. So let's just grab this little collection of larger uncomposted stuff and pile it up over on this side, because we're going to just do a quick check of the material down low on this side. And as you can see, everywhere we scoop in, we find a great number of worms. For me, Usually out on the corners, out on the very far edges, was where I had typically seen the greatest number of, the greatest amount of really dry material, which was typically void of any worms, because they would always try to seek out the more moist areas. But ever since I got my whole dryness problem under control, and the material in my bins has really got a very nice consistent moisture throughout, the worms occupy pretty much every square inch, cubic inch of material within the bin, which really helps speed things along. You know, you don't end up with pockets of uncomposted stuff here and there because the worms are repelled by the dryness. You've got pretty much fair game type material throughout the entire bin, making it really much more efficient, I think. So I don't really see many signs, or any signs, luckily, of any more large chunks of material at the bottom. Maybe I spoke too soon. Here's like some, you know, leafy matter that's not yet been broken down. And, you know, here and there, I'm sure I'll still find pockets of it, because, you know, I'm not going through this very thoroughly, trying so hard to get it all. I'm just doing little spot checks here and there, and doing what I can each time to sort of spread out the work. But I think that we're definitely getting close to the finish line. And as you could tell, from a capacity point of view, we're getting really close to the top of the bin here. I mean, you can see right here, here's the top of the bin. We're only about, you know, an inch away from the rim. So it certainly doesn't leave a lot more room for many more feedings. And that's very often probably the main reason it's time to start steering a bin towards migration and harvesting, because, you know, basically because you're out of room, and you do need to begin that process eventually at some point. So I think I'm kind of selling myself on the idea that it is time to try to migrate these worms out of this material, and now would probably be a good time to begin. So we're going to break away from our typical feeding pattern, which has always, for the most part, been feeding down the center, at least in this bin. It's not consistent in all of my worm bins, but in this bin and the other bin that we're going to feed today, I'm fairly certain that I've been feeding these bins down the center all the while, ever since they came into service. Sometimes I feed a little bit differently, try different feeding patterns, try alternating the feeding locations from place to place, from week to week, or from feeding to feeding. But a lot of times I just find it a lot easier to feed down the middle. This way I always know where to go looking for where the last feeding was administered, so I can check in on it more readily. These two items that I just plucked out of the bottom, peach pit, avocado pit, two extremely hard objects that will probably take forever to break down. So it's kind of an experiment just to see how long it might take. So chances are, if we move the worms, that those bits of food are probably going to go with them. So now we're getting down into some remnants of the previous feeding. These are the rinds of the cantaloupe that was put in here recently. I believe here we've got a piece of paper. And then down here, a little bit surprising actually, is to find a chunk of watermelon that still has some of the red fleshy material on it. And I don't know exactly why that is, because you could tell that this bin is extremely busy. Oh, there's another avocado pit. So after 8 days, you would kind of think that these bins would be almost depleted of food, but at this point, I'll just take what I can get, you know. If they break down some of the food and can't break it all down, I'll attest it to the fact that it's probably just a slower composting item. You know, like this mango seed. The mango seeds definitely take a long time. In order to try to speed that process up, if you've been following along, I've been doing my best in every occasion that I encounter one of these. I take my little pocket knife and I puncture the outer husk of this seed to try to give the worms an access point. And it's a perfect demonstration to show what's happening here. This one larger worm on here, I mean, you can see itsy bitsy tiny worms in certain places on this mango seed. But the largest of the worms right here has actually burrowed down into that hole that I put in here. And you can see that it's attempting to squirm out of the bright lights overhead by going down into the mango seed through the little hole that I created. So I think if we were to just give him another minute or two, he would probably make his way right down into the seed. Or maybe he's just out of room in there because it's not a very large space in there, or at least I would think it's not a very large space. But I think that that's really what I was after. I was really hoping to give these seeds an opportunity at breaking down a little bit more quickly by infiltrating their thick, tough outer husks to give the worms access. Here too, look at that. It's a banana stem, but if you look at this side of it, a whole bunch of worms have made their way right down into the center of it, working their way through the middle and gobbling up the insides of it. It's kind of weird because it's all gooey and mushy and squishy, and I think that's mainly because it's probably more worms inside than anything else at this point. It's always interesting to see what the worms manage in their attempt to break down all the food, the way they do it. It's just fascinating to watch sometimes, or at least I think so. And hopefully a lot of you out there think so too. Well, here, what do we got going on? This just looks like a piece of paper towel into which another peach pit was placed, and the peach pit itself looks like it may not have even been touched because it was just wrapped in a piece of paper. So you know, we'll see. We'll put it aside here and we'll keep it with all the rest of the stuff. But like I said earlier with that other peach pit, that's one of those sort of objects you don't really hold your breath on. You don't expect to see the worms break that down very quickly because it is such a tough, hard object. It takes a great deal of time for that to get broken down, and I'm sure it's not just the worms doing it. I'm sure that the worms depend on the help of a lot of the other life forms in the bin to, you know, get the material broken down to a point where it can actually be consumed. So now I'm kind of thinking ahead here. If I'm going to be feeding off on the edge, then I think a good thing to do while I'm down here inspecting the previous feeding is to try to extract as much as I can in terms of, you know, old bedding that didn't really get broken down yet, as well as all these little chunks of food that's not yet broken down, because then we'll include that in the new feeding zone. But the new feeding zone, like I said earlier, is going to be off on the edge, because we're at this point going to begin trying to encourage the worms to work their way out of all of this compost over to the edge, where we're going to give them a nice fresh set of bedding and food, and hopefully they'll find that that's the place to be, because that's where all the ongoing feedings will occur from this point forward, leaving the rest of this old material to still get broken down, because there's still remaining bits of stuff in here. Down here I guess we're encountering more and more of this uncomposted leafy stuff mixed in with all of this finished castings. I'm not going to try to scoop all of that out of here, but I do like the idea of kind of stirring it up so it's not down at the bottom as we've been doing for a while now. And I think once we've given this old feeding zone a good stir, make sure nothing's really resting up against the bottom, I think we can start trying to move the entire contents over to open up the far edge, and we're going to go with this edge over here, and that's where we're going to set up our feeding zone. So we're going to start piling things up carefully so as not to allow it to spill out, and then we'll start reconstructing the feeding zone over on the far edge to try to spur on the migration of the worms out of their finished compost. But you never really know what to expect. I mean, you kind of know what to expect, but a lot of times you're kind of surprised at what you're seeing, and you're just trying to figure out if your original game plan is still applicable to the current situation. But luckily we already came down here sort of prepared with the idea of taking this next maneuver on this bin to try to kind of wind down the feeding stage. And this is kind of where I start to feel like I'm transitioning out of the typical composting stage where I'm just feeding, trying to break down materials to create the compost. And at this point, I'm sort of at the stage where I feel like it's time to try setting the stage for harvesting. And at that point, even though what we're doing is feeding, I don't treat that as feeding anymore. I treat that as more as feeding for the purposes of depopulating the material of worms. So it's a little bit counterintuitive to say, you know, hey, if you're not feeding anymore, then why are you putting food in? It's because I guess the reason for the food going in, because at this point I'm really treating this as a tub of finished compost, and the ongoing feedings are strictly for the purposes of attracting the worms out of the finished compost, which is, you know, for the most part depleted of food and bedding, and giving them a new place to go, giving them a new place that's more appealing to them. And that's going to be right here in this new space that I'm creating for them. Again, I'm just very carefully trying to not spill stuff over the side here, but I think we've got a pretty good size space in which to set up our new feeding zone. So why don't we get to work on that? So now here, besides a lot of that small chopped cardboard I showed earlier, I've got some of this other larger sheets of cardboard that are pretty much shot. These were resting right beneath this bin. As this bin was dripping and shedding a lot of its liquid through its drainage holes, it was dripping right onto this cardboard, which had been covering up the bin right beneath it, and you know, pretty much destroyed this cardboard. But I didn't trash it, because I knew that the cardboard would come in handy later as bedding material for some future use. So this stuff is already primed and ready for composting, because it's already been infiltrated by a lot of the liquid from a worm bin. So it's probably already pretty rich in a lot of those microscopic materials and life forms that are key to composting. So that's some pretty nice material to begin with as a bedding. So I'm dropping that right down into the bottom. And then a lot of this older bedding that we'd collected along the way, I suppose we can start placing this in here too. So now we've got ourselves a nice robust layer of bedding to complement the food that we're going to be giving them. As much as the worms enjoy eating fresh food, which is a more nitrogen-rich material, they also rely on having a balance between nitrogen-rich foods and carbon-rich foods. And all of this cardboard and paper and stuff is the carbon source that complements their food. So, I mean, like a lot of my feedings, I've got a variety of different things here. There's a piece of lettuce right there. This is a peach that was all bruised up and getting a little bit moldy. And here's a banana peel. All stuff that should really attract the worms over here. And then here we've got a variety of other odds and ends. Here's some cucumber peel shavings, some lettuce, looks pretty brown and nasty. Here we've got another mango seed, which I've actually hacked in half already. See the inside of it right there. So, you know, we already know what's the deal with mango seeds. If you don't give them a way to get in, they don't get in, and then the stuff just sits there. So that's my new mode of operating for dealing with mango seeds, is to always make sure that I give them some way to get into the inside of the seed. So I'm going to sprinkle this with a little bit of grit. Grit in my case is pulverized eggshell. And then all this other stuff over here that we collected, we're going to start returning this to where the feedings are going on. All of this partially eaten food, so that everything over on that side can remain as pretty clean compost which eventually should become uninteresting to the worms because of its lack of nutrition. Pretty much depleted of food at this point. They're pretty close to it at this point. So that's pretty cool. I mean, a lot of the old food items that we recycled, in addition to the new food that we just added, seems to have taken us pretty close to the top here. So I think we're almost ready to kind of bring everything back over, level things off, and let this bin get back to work. Okay, so now this final step of putting in a little bit of a barricade is sort of a cheesy thing. I'm sure a lot of people think it's cheesy, and I'll admit it is cheesy. But it's just something that I like to do, is I like to have some sort of a separator between my new feeding zone over here, which is, you know, by some referred to as a horizontal migration feeding zone, because it's not just a typical feeding zone. It's a feeding zone that's intended to spur on the movement of the worms from one place to another. So I like to put up sort of a little cardboard barrier, which is not meant to prevent the worms from going through. It's really for me to be able to see where, you know, the finished compost is versus where the feeding zone is and where the worms have been encouraged to migrate to. So I'll also usually use my little pocket knife to try to puncture the cardboard barrier in a few places so that the worms don't get obstructed from making their way over. So a lot of times I'll already have these holes punched into the cardboard ahead of time. Here I just figured I would do it on the fly once the cardboard was in position. Now I feel like the worms really don't have anything in their way, you know. If they sense that there's a new feeding zone over there and they get up to the cardboard barrier, or they're not too far from a spot where they can actually make their way across and get to the food. So I think we're almost at the point where we can try leveling all this off. I'm going to try to do it in a way that doesn't cause all the material to spill over the dividing wall. But before I do that, I'd like to try to sort of level this stuff off, pushing it down up against the barrier or the divider. It's going to bring its level down a little bit. And maybe at this point it does make a little bit of sense to perhaps add a little bit more bedding. And that's where I guess we can bring this stuff that I had hacked up earlier today and just use it as a little bit of a covering over the food here. Again, helping to counteract some of the moisture that the food that we're adding is going to introduce. Then I've also got another food item that I always add. It's the coffee that adds up around here day after day, making coffee every day. I always preserve the spent coffee, put it aside so that it can be included in my feedings of my worm bins. So I've just spread that stuff pretty evenly across the top here. And that's gradually bringing us up to a pretty good level, I think. So I'm going to carefully begin backfilling this partition that I placed in here. Trying carefully not to have stuff fly over the partition or out the side, out of the bin. And now that we've kind of taken the contents of the bin and shoved it off to one side, now we're even closer to the top of the container. So it feels to me like this step sort of happened right in the nick of time. And I guess we had the option, if we wanted to relocate this whole thing into a larger container. But I was pretty much ready to call it quits with this batch. I'm ready to start steering it towards harvest, get the compost out of here, and get the worms working on a fresh batch elsewhere. So we've always used our little coffee filters here as a way to indicate where the feedings are happening. So I think just from the perspective of sticking to tradition, we're going to top off our feeding zone with that, although it's quite clear where the feeding zone in this bin is now. And then we'll start covering up. We're now out of the feeding phase and onto the phase that I like to consider as the depopulation, migration, whatever you want to call it, which is really intended to set the stage for harvesting. So it's really the early phases of trying to get get the material harvested out of this tub. So that was pretty cool. I think we're looking good here. You know, I don't think we've got enough moisture in this bin anymore that we're going to see much dripping going on, but you never know. Maybe the holes underneath the feeding zone are going to begin emitting some moisture again, so I'll be keeping an eye on that. If need be, I'll put some sort of a catch tray underneath so it doesn't create a big mess. So let's get onto the other bin. I can see we're still emitting moisture out of this bin. Kind of trashing my tablecloth here. At some point I might need to replace this piece of paper that I use as a tablecloth, but I think I've already gotten about a year out of this thing, so I am due. Whatever, we'll see. Alright, let's get that other bin going. Okay, these two bins are very similar to each other, and you'll notice that as we go along, we've only got a paper covering, as we saw on the previous bin. However, on this paper covering, it seems like we've got a lot more casting material adhering to the paper. It's pretty much on there. I don't know why it doesn't want to flake off. I guess it sticks to paper much more readily than to other things. So I'm not going to sweat it. I'm just going to set it aside that way. But when I look at the castings material on this surface, it just looks like we've got a whole lot more of it, and I don't know why. I do have a funny feeling that this bin may be a little bit more heavily populated than the one we just took care of, even though you might have thought that the last bin we fed was already mobbed with tons and tons of worms. It could be that this bin has even more, but I've not really been keeping good track of that. But it looks so nice. I mean, it's quite clear that the entire surface has been covered with brand new fresh castings over the past 8 days. You can't even really tell where the old surface was, because it was all jumbled up and stirred up and agitated when we last looked in here, but it's all nice and level and flat and fresh with castings every square inch across the top surface. So really, really nice stuff. Here too, we would have fed down the middle, so we're going to save that for last. We're going to give the outer reaches of the bin a quick inspection to see how things look. This bin does not have holes, unlike the one we just dealt with. So I've always kind of suspected that since the two bins are managed very similarly to one another, that this bin might have a little bit of excess when it comes to moisture, and I think we're already seeing some signs of that. See that little puddle that's forming down there? That's evidence of moisture that's been emitted from the foods that they've been getting lately, and that the fact that that moisture has not been able to evaporate out of the container. And you can tell the worms don't mind. A lot of people worry about standing water in their bins, and I don't know if this counts as standing water, but the worms don't seem to mind. In fact, I think they thrive in more damp conditions because they are not put off by it in the least bit. They're right down there hanging out just like anywhere else in the bin. So it's always kind of interesting to see. So I think we're going to begin jostling this material around in such a way that we do also at the same time start piling things up as high as we can over on this edge, so that by the time we get over to the other edge, we have the ability to open up a spot to put our feeding zone into and get the horizontal migration in this bin started too. I guess if I find any uncomposted larger chunks of food, I'll set them aside so we can include them in our feeding when we rebuild the feeding zone on the other edge. I think this might have been a banana stem. Down here I'm also finding some of these uncomposted bedding type materials, leafy material and leaf stems and stuff like that. All stuff that'll come in really handy in the new feeding zone when we set it all up. Here too, I'm pretty sure I had done my best to try to jostle up the bottom to make sure a lot of this stuff, leafy material that might have been resting at the bottom, is lifted up out of the bottom reaches of the bin. So all I'm really doing by going down to the bottom is trying to make sure that that stuff is up off the bottom and suspended within the material. And every time I set up a new feeding zone and I use leaves as my bedding, it's it's gonna take a little bit of time for them to eventually break down the stick portions of each leaf. They'll eat up the soft part of the leaf 1, 2, 3, but the harder parts of the leaf always remain and take a bit longer to get broken down. I don't want to jostle up the middle too much, because that's where the feeding zone would have been last time. Although maybe we should just keep working our way across. If we find old food scraps, old bedding, we'll just start putting it aside so we can use it in the rebuild of the feeding zone on the far edge. These are some of the cardboard chunks we had laid down as bedding underneath the food last time. Again, it was placed in dry in the hopes that it would help absorb some of the moisture in the bin, and I'm sure it helped a little bit, but as you can see, the bin still has a very high level of moisture that hopefully in time will begin to evaporate away. Once again, we've got our mango seed. Again, has been punctured to try to let the worms in so they can start breaking it down. Here again, another peach pit. Here we've got a mango seed that was actually sawed in half to let the worms gain access to the center of it much more readily, and you can see it's pretty soft. I can actually crush it in my fingers. This, I believe, might still be a section of a pumpkin stem, which has sort of split down the middle, and you can see a worm hanging out right down the middle of it. Always fun stuff. And this is what ends up taking so much time when I'm doing my bins, is just me getting sidetracked, always wanting to check everything out. So let's see if we can be a little bit more expeditious in our work here to get the thing done. Let these worms get back to work. So bedding to be recycled. This is really a banana peel. Stick it over there with the rest of the food. Pretty large piece of food, probably part of the last feeding. Here we've got sort of lettuce and bedding and different stuff mixed together. Another banana peel. As popular as banana peels are, they don't vanish immediately. They do take a couple weeks, but they don't last long, you know. And in a worm bin, a couple weeks is a pretty quick turnaround for having something consumed and broken down. So when I see a banana peel that's this far along, I know that it's been in the bin for a week or two, but after that, by the 3rd or 4th week, I don't expect to see much of it. Another piece of watermelon with a lot of the red fleshy part of it still intact. It's interesting. I always imagined that that would be one of the things to go first. Another mango seed that was sawed in half. But I don't want to go too crazy. I'm separating things just so I can get a better sense of how much of this I've got, how much of that I got. But it's certainly not important. I could just as easily grab anything that's not compost and pile it up, and we could use it in our new feeding zone. I'm really just doing this so I can get a better sense of how things are progressing. So we're just going to start stacking things up over here to the side for the purposes of getting everything moved over and opening up a little bit of a new section where we can set up their new feeding zone. But I think if it wasn't for me playing around in here, the material wouldn't really, the puddles probably wouldn't really be there at the bottom. I think most of the moisture we're seeing settling down at the bottom is stuff that I've actually sort of squeezed out of the compost as we've encountered it. What's this? Wow, look at this. You know, that's a little bit surprising, I've got to say, because I've really made an effort recently to try to dig down low into all of my feeding zones to make sure that a lot of this old bedding material, old leafy matter usually, that's resting at the bottom has had a chance to get stirred up and sort of reintroduced out into the material at large. You know, with the main objective of just getting it off the bottom so that it has just as much of a chance of being eaten and broken down as the rest of the stuff. So maybe that's just one little pocket that I missed when I was doing these stirs in the past. But you know, other than the one or two hunks of food that we found down in the feeding zone and now in the outskirts, everything else is just this really rich, dark castings material. Obviously populated extremely densely with worms throughout. So I'm sure they're still finding stuff in this material that they're able to eat. In fact, I think I heard somewhere that even if the worms do break down all of the food that you've given them and all of the bedding that you've given them, that they can actually go back and start re-eating some of their old castings. So I guess maybe the material just goes through their bodies so quickly that they don't actually have a chance to extract all of the nourishment from the food the first go around. So I think the number is 7. I think there was something, I don't know how people come up with these numbers or whether it's even true or not, but I believe what I read recently was that the castings material can actually be consumed by the worms up to 7 times before it's completely depleted of anything that would be of value to the worms. So to me that just seemed pretty interesting, you know, and it kind of takes the pressure off, you know. Even if you were to leave a bin, kind of forget about it or whatever, something were to happen that you were unable to tend to the needs of your worms, it seems like they'd be pretty well off for quite a while just continuing to eat and then re-eat their castings. It sounds a little bit gross if you think about it, but it does also kind of make sense, because you always hear about how worms are able to consume whatever, half their body weight on a daily basis. So at that pace, I've got to imagine that the digestive system that's trying to extract nourishment from that material doesn't really get a chance to utilize everything in the food. Most of it probably just goes out the back, leaving a lot of it for future use. So we've got ourselves a nice setup over here. We're going to follow suit with what we did before. I'm going to grab some of that old material that got really, really wet recently, and we're going to lay that down here as bedding. So let me grab some of that. Here again, some of it remained dry. However, most of it got dripped on and is soaked. So it's a little bit of a combination of both here. I'll just try to tear it into some slightly smaller chunks so that we can lay it out here as our bedding for the feeding zone here on the side. I do have another couple chunks that we can use as our partition wall here. We'll bring those in later when we need them. I'm just using my clean hand here to try to be a little bit more efficient here. Wondering if I were to just kind of crumble these things off, if they would not mat up against each other as much as they seem like they want to. Let's try that. I'm sure it'll all settle and crush down under its own weight and from the moisture and from the breakdown process. But for now I just want something that's a little bit airy, a little bit elevated, and something that's nice and carbon rich to place under our food so that we have a good balance. And like we did before, we're just going to start grabbing some of this old material. Let's save the old bedding materials that we salvaged to cover up the food. Why don't we start next with using some of these old reclaimed food items as a start, and we've got fresh food to add as well. But here it seems like we've got perhaps a little bit more leftovers than we had in the other bin. So we might not need to add as much fresh food. And we'll see how we look once we get everything piled in here. You know, stuff like this is just slow composting stuff. At some point it'll get extracted with the worms, moved with the worms into their new space, wherever that may be, once we get around to migrating them out of here, and then it'll have an opportunity going forward to continue breaking down. But since those are slow composting items in a lot of cases, these seeds and these stems, it does make sense to include some nice fresh stuff in here as well. So I think we'll do that after we pile in a little bit more of this fresh dry cardboard on top of the old food. Trying to be less stingy with the carbon and the bedding. A lot of times it seems like I could use a lot more bedding material than I do use. So let's see, some of this kind of wet and gooey bedding material, it's already kind of worked over. Let's put that on top of the fresh food. Let's grab a few handfuls of fresh food, but we're not going to use too much. Here I've got a fresh banana peel. Not as fresh as it can be after sitting in the freezer for a while. Here too is a part of a rotten peach. I think we'll wrap up down here with some peelings off of a mango, peelings off of a cucumber. This looks like that might be the other half of that mango seed that we placed into the other bin. I know, slow composting stuff, but still hopefully stuff that's going to draw the attention of the worms and get them to come out of their finished compost and over into our feeding zone. So I still think we're going to put a little bit more coffee on top like we did in the other bin, but first we're going to set up our partition wall again like we did before. So for that, I've once again got a couple older pieces of cardboard that have been soaked from the drippings coming out of the other bin that we just fed, because this is all cardboard that had been covering up the bin right beneath. And like we did earlier, I'm going to put some holes into this so that there's no real obstacle preventing the worms from making their way through. This really damp cardboard punctures very easily. So I'm going to try to spread all this out just a little bit. I don't want the feeding zone to be too large, but I just want to be able to set things up here in such a way that I've got a little bit of a sort of a equal amount of pressure coming at this cardboard from both sides. So as we begin lowering this heap of finished compost up against the partition wall, we're going to lower the overall level of the bin throughout. Now we can also take some of this old material here, this old bedding stuff that we retrieved as we went along. It's chunks of old cardboard, chunks of leafy matter, and put it over where we want all the action to be. But I'm sure if some of it remains, it's not the end of the world. Hopefully the worms will continue to come up and do away with that as well. But at some point we really do want them to start focusing their energies on the migration zone and getting over here so we can extract them out of the material. Definitely wet, you know? So it's a good thing that I'm covering up with only paper. And it even makes me wonder if it would make good sense, at least for maybe a week or two, to maybe even leave this uncovered. Even though the air is very humid nowadays, I wouldn't want the paper on top, even though it's just a single thin piece of paper. I wouldn't want that to inhibit evaporation of this material, because it is a little bit more damp than it needs to be. Wow, very, very damp, gooey stuff. I also don't want this to start going anaerobic. Anaerobic, I believe, just you know, opposite of aerobic. Aerobic would be airy, you know, there's a lot of airflow. Anaerobic, I guess, just means lack of airflow. When there's a lack of airflow, things do get funky in your worm bin, so you got to be careful, and it's usually at times like this when you've got very, very damp conditions. So even though I'm trying to jostle things around to create air pockets here and there, it probably won't help much. It'll probably all settle back down, and whatever little bits of air pockets there were will all get filled in. But in that little bit of time, that little bit of air down there, it will help things continue in a good way. When things get anaerobic and there's no more airflow, in the material, that's when certain types of really stinky, smelly bacteria begin to thrive. And that's when you start getting somewhat stinky conditions in your bin. And that's what we want to try to avoid here proactively. I haven't sensed any of it yet, but the conditions are ripe for that to occur, so we're just trying to proactively prevent that from occurring. So we're almost done here. I'm going to sprinkle some of this stuff with grit. We're going to take the last of our coffee and drop it in here on top. I think coffee is sort of a natural barrier preventing the smell to come through and attract pests. And then I think we're almost ready to cover up here. We've got our old feeding zone indicator, which will once again cover where our feeding zone is, and once again it's clear to see where the feeding zone is on these horizontal migrations, especially since I use a barrier. But it's really just keeping to tradition, I guess, and since it's there anyway. Hopefully the worms will take advantage of it and nibble on that as well if they feel they need carbon and they happen to be there nearby. And this is the part of it that I'm still debating on. Do I want to cover up or do I not want to cover up? So, you know what? Why don't we do this? I'm going to try to fold in the clean side. We'll leave the dirty side, the dirtier side low, and whatever, the somewhat dirty side up. And we will cover up, but I'm going to cover up only on this side, so that hopefully on this other side we've got a little bit more evaporation happening. And over the feeding zone I'm not so worried about moisture recirculating. In fact, I think there's a benefit to it over on that side. So maybe the covering will keep in some of the moisture and make it even more interesting for them to go over there once the moisture level gets to where they find it interesting and appealing. But you know, you could tell the moisture throughout this bin is very high, so it's really the food, I think, that's going to end up attracting them into here, not any sort of a moisture situation. Obviously the moisture over here is much higher and probably a lot more appealing to the worms than anything else. So I guess we'll just have to see, you know, see how things progress in this bin. But for now, I think the best bet is just to leave this open, let it evaporate, and start watching it to see how we do in terms of getting the worms to move out. That's where we stand. This 82-day-old bin, the other 113-day-old bin, at this point, no longer in the feeding stage, moving on to the next stage that I consider as migration, evacuation, whatever you want to call it. But the whole idea is that the finished compost needs to be emptied of worms so that now it can be treated as a batch of true finished compost. I'm going to put some things away here and get things cleaned up, but none of that's worth filming. It's boring. I'll spare you all that, so I'll just take this as a quick opportunity to say thank you. Thank you so much for sticking around and watching my video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. Also consider subscribing to my channel. That's really appreciated too. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.